Okay, guys, welcome back. We are just going to cover the government structure of Iran. It gets a little complicated, so bear with me because we'll get to some charts at the end which may clarify the power structure, but it's very different from anything that we know really today. It's very different from the UK. It's very different from the American system. So it's a little difficult to wrap your heads around, but I have faith and know you can do it. Okay, so the 1979 Constitution, created by the one and only Ayatollah Khomeini, created the Iranian government as we know it today. And actually, before we move into that, I want to just talk about the 1979 revolution. This is something I want you to noodle on. How does the type of revolution and change, political and economic change that we're seeing in Iran compare to the UK? So just noodle on that a little bit as we think about the revolution and its significance in Iranian culture and Iranian history. Okay, so we start off with the supreme leader of Iran. The supreme leader is the most powerful man in Iran. He is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. He appoints the head of the judiciary and is the state broadcaster. And he appoints half of the members of the Guardian Council. So he appoints 6 members of the Guardian Council. There's a total of 12 in the Guardian Council. We'll get to that, so don't worry. And that is the powerful body which vets candidates for presidential and parliamentary elections. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. But the big thing to know is that the supreme leader is the most powerful man in Iran, who really has even more power than the president, which is a little wacky to Western sensibilities, but he is the most powerful man in Iran. There have only been 2 supreme leaders to date. The first one was Ayatollah Khomeini, and now we have Ali Khamenei, who's the picture you see to the right. Ali Khamenei, or it's actually Khamenei, has ruled from 1989 to the present. One thing to note is he's getting a little bit older. And interestingly, so Khomeini was an Ayatollah, right? We talked about what an Ayatollah is in the previous lecture. Ayatollah is a religious leader, but there's kind of different levels of being a religious leader. You have the clerics and mullahs, kind of at the bottom levels, and then you move to Ayatollah, and then there's such a thing as a grand Ayatollah. To be honest, the difference between a grand Ayatollah and a regular Ayatollah in terms of power is not that big, but Khomeini was just a regular Ayatollah, so that's good to know. Khamenei is not an Ayatollah, and that's interesting because when they made the rules about how to select a supreme leader, initially they had required that person to be an Ayatollah. However, Khamenei was hand-selected by Khomeini, and because Khamenei was just a mullah or a cleric, he was not at the Ayatollah level quite yet, but because he was handpicked by Khomeini, they were BFFs, and he was very well liked for the position, and so they actually made an exception and changed the rules so that Khamenei could become the supreme leader. So just bearing in mind that he's getting a little bit old, the question becomes, who will select the next, and how will he be selected? And who will become the next one? So that's a big question we're going to talk about a little bit more in a little bit. This is a political cartoon talking about the Supreme Leader's prayer rug. There have been some questions about voter fraud. The Supreme Leader gets to basically dictate a lot of the politics and political goings-on that happen in Iran, and sometimes because the Supreme Leader has his own personal army, which we're going to hear a little bit about in a little bit, they've been accused of using violence. The Basiji fall under the Supreme Leader's power, and so the Basiji, who I think Sarah is going to talk about, have used a lot of violence against their own people. So that's where this cartoon comes in. You might get a better understanding after the presentations. So the big question, as I mentioned, is who will become the next supreme leader? Interestingly, the Assembly of Experts leader, so the head of the Assembly of Experts, just died this past Tuesday. And it raises a lot of questions about the supreme leader. Khamenei is 75 years old, and he recently had prostate surgery. And this is an article which comes from the BBC, and it's interesting. It talks a little bit about what the process might be, and it shows some pictures of Ayatollah Khamenei in his hospital bed. So these are with his clerics, and you can see that he's very, very powerful. Interestingly, by the way, Khamenei was the president of Iran when Grand Ayatollah Khomeini was in power, and then Khamenei moved from president to supreme leader. As I mentioned, they changed the requirements. So it's interesting. So this is an interesting article that you may want to explore. As I said, we'll come to the links a little bit later. So back to the presentation. Return to full screen. So interestingly, the Supreme Leader has his own Twitter page, which I found really fascinating because this is just a screenshot of some of his tweets and some of his followers. The country should be run by, these are some of his tweets, the country should be run by domestic forces and youth's talents. That's how no power can play games with a country's economic fate. So the English needs a little work. But when the economy relies on oil, the fate of the country will fall to the hands of global oil policymakers who drop prices all of a sudden. So you guys may know that recently the price of oil dropped really significantly. And remembering back to the fact that Iran's economy is based solely on oil, this is a problem for Iran. And so it'll be really interesting to learn a little bit more about their economy, which I'm going to talk about on Monday in class. And how they're going to react and what that means. So it's interesting. You guys might want to check it out. His Twitter handle is Khamenei_IR, Iran. So just interesting to take a peek at. So the Supreme Leader, under the Supreme Leader, we have the President. And the President is elected to a 4-year term by the direct vote of the people. Hold on a second. He is elected? Yes. And this is where it gets a little confusing because Iran is what we consider a democratic, authoritarian theocracy. But it's a little wacky, right? We're combining a lot of different terms here. So the president is actually elected by the people to a 4-year term by the direct vote of the people. He may not serve more than 2 consecutive terms. And this is where it gets interesting. He does not have power over foreign policy. Wait, but isn't he the president? Yeah, but the Supreme Leader is the guy who actually has power over foreign policy. He does not have power over the armed forces. And another big one, he does not have power over nuclear power. So, interesting. The new president his name is Hassan Rouhani. He's been in power since 2013, and he succeeded a guy named Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Say it together. Ahmadinejad. It's a hard one. And I'll talk about him again on Monday. He's a very interesting, very conservative leader, and so we'll hear a lot about Ahmadinejad later. But what you need to know is that now, as of 2013, Hassan Rouhani is the president of Iran. It's a little confusing because Rouhani and Khamenei look a little bit similar, but they're very different people with very different roles, so keep that in mind. Okay, so then you have the Assembly of Religious Experts. And the Assembly of Religious Experts are people who are experts on Iranian law, which, as you'll remember, is mostly Sharia law. They are an assembly of 73 clerics who are elected directly by the people. Okay, keep that in mind. They're elected directly by the people. Then you have the Expediency Council. And the Expediency Council is known as the intermediary between the Guardian Council and the Majlis. Okay, what's the Majlis? We reviewed it briefly at the beginning of Iran, but we'll go back to that in a little bit. The Expediency Council has an advisory role to the supreme leader. So they are the 39 most powerful people in Iran, and they are chosen by the supreme leader, so they're not elected. And this includes people like the president, the speaker of the Majlis, the chief of the judiciary, head of media, and head of oil. And they have kind of patron-client relations. And the idea is that if you're BFFs with the supreme leader, you're probably going to be in the Expediency Council. They are the most wealthy people of Iran, and they are the people with the most power. Okay, so then we have the Revolutionary Guard. So this is not the Iranian military, but this is the supreme leader's kind of personal military. So the Revolutionary Guard are the supreme leader's personal private military. They are probably the second or third most powerful institution in Iran. And they're, like I mentioned, the secondary military. Iran has a national military, and this is the Revolutionary Guard is separate from that. And that includes the people like the Basiji, who are the voluntary members of the Revolutionary Guard, aka the morality police, who go around enforcing the laws of Islam. Then you also have somebody who's the head of the judiciary. The head of the judiciary is picked by the supreme leader, but hang on a second, isn't that combining laws and religion? Yes, and remember, there is no separation of mosque and state in Iran. So the head of the judiciary is interpreting all of the laws, both Sharia law and the other laws, and it kind of helps the supreme leader to help stack the deck against reformers. The supreme leader is very conservative, right, because he's an Islamic cleric, and so he doesn't like the people who are reformers very much. The reformers want to move to a more democratic state, and so by having the supreme leader personally pick the head of the judiciary, it means that the judiciary is probably going to have a very conservative interpretation of all laws that will help kind of prop up the supreme leader. Okay, so then we have the Majlis. The Majlis is a group of people, 290 seats, and they have the authority to make and pass laws and to approve cabinet ministers who report to the president. Okay, so you've got the president, and the president has his cabinet ministers, and those cabinet ministers are elected by the Majlis. Interestingly, the Majlis, so there's no kind of religious requirement, but I guess there kind of is, because there are 290 seats, and the seats are guaranteed 5 Armenians to people of the book. So 5 Armenians, 4 Assyrians, who are the Catholics, 3 Jewish seats, and 2 Zoroastrian seats. And then the rest all go to Shiites. So these are the people who are making the laws, right? They can make and then they pass some of the laws, and then they approve the cabinet ministers who report to the president. And while that sounds like a big deal, remember that the president doesn't have that much power. Okay. So then we also have something called the Guardian Council. And the Guardian Council is a council of clerics. So clerics, what's a cleric? A religious leader. So it's a council of religious leaders who have the authority to veto any legislation passed by the Majlis. Okay, so the Majlis is elected by the popular vote, right, by the people, but the Guardian Council kind of has a check on the Majlis because they get to check and say, oh, you know what, that law doesn't really fall under Sharia law, so we're actually going to veto that law. Okay, so that's where it gets a little tricky. Is this a real democracy or not? Big question. So there are 12 members of the Guardian Council. 6 of these members are picked by the Supreme Leader, and then the other 6 are picked by the Majlis. So that's where maybe it gets a little bit more kind of quote-unquote fair or democratic. Okay, so what are the big kind of observations in terms of the big picture that we're seeing? Number one is that Iran does not have the traditional 3-branch system that we're used to seeing between the legislative branch, the judicial branch, and the executive branch. We're not going to see that in Iran. So throw it out the window when you think of Iranian politics. First of all, there's way more than three bodies, right? More than three institutions, right? We've got the Expediency Council, the Supreme Leader, you've got the President, you've got the Majlis, and on and on. And also that means that there's not really a system of checks and balances. I mean, there is in terms of religion, but not so much in terms of power, right? So keep that in mind. There is no separation of mosque and state. So religion and politics are very much mixed in Iran. And that's going to mean that that's going to complicate things sometimes. Yeah, so you'll see. And things are left up to interpretation, right? Who gets to interpret the laws? Generally, the religious leaders get to say whether, yes, this is constitutional or whether, yes, this agrees with the Sharia law. Another big thing to note is that in Iran, there is lots of rapid revolutionary change that is very different from the gradual change that we saw in the UK. So there's big revolutions that change absolutely everything, and then things will be fine for a little bit, and then there'll be another big revolution. And there's two different groups of people that we'll see. We'll see the reformers, who are the people who want things to change, right? Generally, they want things to move towards democracy. And then you also have the conservatives. And the conservatives tend to be the religious clerics who want things to stay the same way as they are now, where the religious clerics and religious leaders have a lot more power than the people who are elected democratically. So keep in mind that there are those two groups. There's the reformers who want democratic change, and then you have the conservatives who want things to stay the same. Okay, now we get to the charts. Don't freak out. These look really complicated, but once you have a good understanding of them, it's not so bad. And I'm going to show you a series of 3 different charts. You've got this chart, you've got the next chart, and you have a third chart. Okay, so take a look at these 3 charts. I'll start with this one. What do you see? So at the very bottom, you've got the voters. Okay, so the voters help to elect parliament. And parliament, in this case, is the same as the Majlis. Okay, so the Majlis, let's go to the right first, help to elect the cabinet, the president's cabinet. Okay, the president also has some say in who is going to be the cabinet and who those 22 ministers are going to be. Okay, so let's go up to the cabinet. And the picture you see is of Ahmadinejad, so I think this is an older chart. So ignore his face. That's not what he looks like now. But this president serves a 4-year term with a limit of 2 consecutive terms, and he's the head of the executive. But it gets a little tricky because there isn't really an executive judicial, so ignore that term. Okay, so then look over to the left, and you've got the Guardian Council. So the Guardian Council, this is important, they're the people that vet who can and who cannot run for president. So they will look at all the people who want to run for president and say, this guy he's not conservative enough, so we veto him. This guy, he's a little bit too reformist for our liking, so we're going to veto him too. So while yes, the people get to vote for their president, the president has already been selected from a pool of people. The pool that they get to choose the president from has already been pre-screened to make sure that he's going to teach the way that the Supreme Leader wants him to, or to approve laws that the Supreme Leader wants him to. So that's where it gets a little tricky. It's technically the president is voted upon, but it's voted on. They don't really have that much say. It's not like a free vote where anybody can run for president. It doesn't quite work like that. So, okay, so moving left to the graph, that from the Guardian Council, we get to the Supreme Leader. And then remember, the Supreme Leader, he's the big dog. He's the guy who has the most power in Iran. He selects his advisors. And then you have on the right, the Assembly of Experts. And the Assembly of Experts, they are the people that get to appoint and monitor the Supreme Leader And yes, technically the Assembly of Experts is voted on by the voters, but again, not really. Okay, so that's where this is a complicated system. It has the pieces that would make you think that it's a democracy, but when you look a little bit closer, it's not really democratic. So it's a complicated system. So looking down, the supreme leader has power over the judicial system, right? Because he gets to select the head of the judiciary, among other people. He also controls the state-run media. And that's important because media plays a huge role in politics. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. We saw that a little bit in England and the UK. But the media, especially when it's censored, plays a huge role in what is seen and what is not seen, and what propaganda can be distributed by the media. He also has power over mosques, right? So he is the supreme leader, supreme religious leader. So he has a lot of religious power. And then looking left again, he has power over the military. Remember, the Revolutionary Guard comes under the power of the supreme leader, but so does the army. So those are good to know. He controls the army. He also controls the Basiji and the Revolutionary Guard. Okay, so that's the first map. Then we get to this one. This one's a little tricky, but this one's helpful to see which are the elected institutions, if you look up at the very top, and which are the unelected institutions. The elected institutions are the president, the cabinet, and the parliament, and kind of the Guardian Council. But the Guardian Council gets, remember, the Majlis gets to appoint 6 members of the Guardian Council, and then the Supreme Leader gets to choose 6 members of the Guardian Council. Then you look over at the unelected institutions, and this basically, the Supreme Leader basically gets to choose all of these people. So the Supreme Leader gets to choose the armed forces, head of the armed forces, so somebody he knows who is going to follow his orders. The Supreme Leader gets to appoint the head of the judiciary, so the guy who's going to enforce all of the laws. And then he also gets to choose the Expediency Council, which is kind of the intermediary between the Majlis and the Guardian Council. And lastly, he gets to appoint 6 members of the Guardian Council. Okay, so keep all this in mind. Okay, again, this is the last chart. A little bit complicated again, but if you start with the elected institutions, elected we have the Parliament, President, and some of the Assembly of Experts. Appointed by elected institutions, we have the Guardian Council, the Cabinet, and the Supreme Leader. And then the unelected institutions are the head of the judiciary, the armed forces, and the Expediency Council. Okay, last chart. This is interesting, and I actually find this one being the most informative. So look closest at this one. The hierarchy of power in Iran, one man above all others. So here you can see who has power and who doesn't in Iran. And I would argue that, and this argues that the Supreme Leader has the most power, and that actually the Revolutionary Guard has the second most power. This is helpful because it's kind of a ranking. Then the Guardian Council has the third most power. The President has the 4th most power. National Security Council has the 5th most power. And then within this you have the Assembly of Experts, the Expediency Council, the Majlis, etc. So look closest at this chart, and then we can discuss the other charts in class. Okay, so we're going to talk about a little bit more about the Iran-Iraq War and Khamenei taking power, but we're going to talk about that in class and the kind of structure. So we'll review the rest of this in class, and then I'm going to leave you on this political cartoon, which I think is great. Repeat after me. Democracy is alive and well in Iran, and it's a member of the Basiji standing on top of a woman. The beatings will continue until the morale improves. So on this note, I'm going to leave you with this. Do your reading in the Essentials textbook, and I'll see you on Monday.